The 1960s were a decade of revolution and change in politics, music, and society around the world. It started in the United States and the United Kingdom and spread to the continental Europe and other parts of the globe. It was a decade of hope, change, and war that witnessed an important shift in American culture. Citizens from all walks of life sought to expand the meaning of the American promise. Their efforts helped unravel the national consensus and laid bare a far more fragmented society. As a result, people from a wide range of ethnic groups attempt to reform American society to make it more equitable. The 1960s were also an era of protests. In the civil rights movement, black and white people protested against the unfair treatment of races. Towards the end of the decade, more and more Americans protested against the war in Vietnam. Many people in the United States thought that Americans had no reason to fight in war that was so far away from home. The beginning of the 60s. The decade began symbolically on February 1, 1960, when four African American students at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College in Greensboro sat down at the lunch counter at the local Woolworths and South to order coffee and donuts. Their courageous determination, at a time when the great majority of African Americans lived in segregated communities and attended segregated schools on both sides of Mason-Dixon line, and none attended the all-white state universities of South, sparked a new, more militant, direct action phase of the civil rights movement. By September 1961, nearly 70,000 students had engaged in sit-ins to desegregate restaurants, churches, libraries, and movie theaters. Meanwhile, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, began organizing freedom rides through the South to dramatize the widespread violation of a 1960 Supreme Court ruling banning segregation in interstate transportation. The vicious assaults upon the Freedom Riders in the bright glare of television coverage then brought yet more African Americans into the freedom struggle. In the spring of 1963, Martin Luther King Jr., determined to expose the violent extremism of the white racism and to force President John F. Kennedy to push for strong civil rights legislation, organized a series of marches and sit-ins in Birmingham, Alabama. They succeeded in provoking Police Commissioner Eugene O'Connor to resort to brutal force. They televised scenes of high-pressure water hoses and snarling police dogs being used against nonviolent demonstrators, many of them children, filled many Americans with revulsion. Kennedy responded by proposing a comprehensive civil rights bill. To push Congress to pass the measure, nearly 250,000 Americans converged on the Capitol late in August. There, they heard King proclaim his dream of freedom and justice and brotherhood, but not even one of the greatest speeches in history moved Congress to act. It would take the assassination in Texas of the popular President Kennedy in November 1963 and the desire of his Texan successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, to prove himself to liberals to produce the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The most far-reaching civil rights legislation in U.S. history, it banned racial discrimination and segregation in most public accommodations, in employment, and in federally funded programs. Civil rights leaders then focused on gaining a Voting Rights Act. Once again, violent attacks upon black protesters in March 1965 precipitated legislative action. This time, state troopers attacked marchers in Selma, Alabama, where only 335 of the 15,000 eligible black voters were registered to vote. The president then proposed, and Congress passed, the Voting Rights Act, which was signed into law in August. It eliminated many barriers to registration, such as literacy tests, used to restrict voting by blacks, dramatically increasing the number of African American registered voters and black political clout. The fight for civil rights. The African American civil rights movement made significant progress in the 1960s. While Congress played a role by passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Civil Rights Act of 1968, the actions of civil rights groups were instrumental in forging new paths, pioneering new techniques and strategies, and achieving breakthrough successes. Civil rights activists engage in sit-ins, freedom rides, and pro-state marches and registered African American voters. Despite the movement's many achievements, however, change remained slow, and many grew frustrated with the failure of the government to alleviate poverty and the persistence of violence against African Americans, particularly the tragic 1968 assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Many African Americans in the mid to late 1960s adopted the ideology of Black Power, which promoted their work within their own communities to redress problems without the aid of whites. Although the African American civil rights movement was the most prominent of the crusades for racial justice, other ethnic minorities also worked to seize their piece of the American dream during the promising years of the 1960s. Many were influenced by the African American cause and often used similar tactics. The Mexican American civil rights movement, led largely by Cesar Chavez, also made significant progress at this time. The emergence of the Chicano movement signaled Mexican Americans' determination to seize their political power, celebrate their cultural heritage, and demand their citizenship rights. By the 1960s, a generation of white Americans raised in prosperity and steeped in a culture of conformity of the 1950s had come of age. However, many of these baby boomers, those born between 1946 and 1964, rejected the conformity and luxuries that their parents had provided. These young, middle-class Americans, especially those fortunate enough to attend college when many of their working-class and African-American contemporaries were being sent to Vietnam, began to organize to fight for their own rights and end the war that was claiming the lives of so many. Influenced and inspired by the civil rights movement, organizations and student groups formed across the country to protest the Vietnam War, advocate for women's rights, and stand up against discrimination faced by lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer LGBTQ people. As groups like the Students for a Democratic Society and the National Organization of Women now asserted their rights and strove for equality for themselves and others, they appended many accepted norms and set groundbreaking social and legal changes in motion. Many of their successes continue to be felt today, while other goals remain unfulfilled. American Indians, LGBTQ people, and women organized to change discriminatory laws and pursue government support for their rights. Others, disenchanted with the status quo, distanced themselves from white, middle-class America by forming their own countercultures centered on a desire for peace, the rejection of material goods and traditional morality, concern for the environment, and drug use in pursuit of spiritual revelations. These groups, whose aims and tactics posed a challenge to the existing state of affairs, often met with hostility from individuals, local officials, and the US government alike. Still, they persisted, determined to further their goals and secure for themselves the rights and privilege to which they were entitled as American citizens. The Vietnam War and the Space Oddity. The country's role in Vietnam revealed the limits of military power and the contradictions of US foreign policy. Its increasing support for the Vietnam War also led to a steady rise in dissatisfaction and active protest at home, especially from student-led groups around the country. In 1963, Lyndon Johnson brought to his presidency a vision of a great society in which everyone could share in the opportunities that the United States offered for a better life, and in which the words liberty and justice for all would have a real meaning. His social programs, investments in education, support for the arts, and commitment to civil rights changed the lives of countless people and transformed the society in many ways. However, Johnson's insistence on maintaining American commitments in Vietnam, a policy begun by his predecessors, hurt both his ability to realize his vision of the Great Society and his support among the American people. Kennedy's assassination in 1963 and the assassinations 5 years later of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy made it dramatically clear that not all Americans shared this vision of a more inclusive democracy. The United States became more embroiled in international politics in the 1960s, striving to prevent the spread of communism and maintaining its position as a world superpower. Named as the Cold War, it has its most remarkable episode with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Those different politics between the United States and the communist Soviet Union brought to the world a mind-blowing war made by psychological pressure and a global cultural fear. In parallel with the military crisis, the space race between the two powers began. They created space agencies equipped with the best scientists and technical means. The ambition to be the first to go into space made the rehearsals and launching of space rockets more and more frequent. The disputes only slowed down with the successful arrival on the moon by the American Apollo 11 mission. Reborn of a culture. After World War II, people all over the world started working hard and respecting the values that were brought up with. Especially in Europe, it was an era of recovery and rebuilding. In the 1960s, many young people started adopting such values. They protested against society and everything that was mainstream. They had hair long and wore unusual and strange clothes. Social change was also reflected in the music of the decade. In the 1950s, America and the rest of the world danced and sang to the rock and roll music. A decade later, Bob Dylan, Blowing in the Wind, Joan Baez, and other protest singers composed lyrics that show what was going wrong in society. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones started a new era of beat and pop music. In Europe, pirate radio stations broadcast from ships in the North Sea. Television dominated the decades as the most important entertainment medium. By the end of the decade, almost all homes in America had at least one TV set. Towards the end of the 1960s, hundreds of thousands of young music fans gathered at Woodstock, New York, to celebrate the largest pop festival ever held. All of the popular musicians of the time performed there: Jimi Hendrix, Joe Cocker, The Who, Janis Joplin, and others. Many of the young people there called themselves hippies. They took drugs, preferably marijuana and LSD, which allowed people to see a colorful and real world. They believed in sexual freedom and often changed partners at random. On the other side of the social scale, many people looked strangely at these protesters. They could not understand them and stuck to hard work and family values. Finally, I would like to show you a very interesting video that covers all the important events in the 1960s. I hope you enjoy it.
Hi, my name's Uhuru Williams, I'm a historian, and here's what you need to know to sound smart about the 1960s. In 1964, singer Bob Dylan scored a hit with the song, "The Times They Are A-Changing." This literally could be the mantra for the decade of the 1960s, which witnessed great social, economic, and political change in America. From 1960 to the end of the decade, a succession of social movements sought to stamp out inequalities in American society. The most prominent of these movements was the Civil Rights Movement, which, continuing from the 1950s, sought to ensure absolute equality before the law for African Americans in the United States. The Women's Movement tackled the pay disparity in work and also argued for more opportunities for women to contribute to the nation's social, economic, and political life. One of the other great social movements of the 1960s was the counterculture movement. Fueled by new music, new taste, and new social norms, this counterculture changed the fabric of American society. This counterculture movement found its greatest political expression in protest against the war in Vietnam, where young people burned their draft cards and refused to fight in a war that they deemed immoral. The Stonewall Rebellion in New York in 1969 also signaled that lesbian, gay, and transgender Americans also wanted equal rights and the ability to exist in a society free from sexual discrimination. By the close of the decade, the nonviolent civil rights movement and the optimism that people had felt about the possibility of the expansion of American democracy began to take a turn. Civil rights was replaced in the minds of many in the mainstream by Black power. Peaceful protest against the war in Vietnam by massive protests across the country, and a women's movement that in the minds of conservatives threatened the status quo and the family in America. All of these contributed to the rise of Richard Nixon and his success in the 1968 election.